I'm in the UK with my dear friend, colleague, and research buddy, Akhil Patel, Director of Property Share Market Economics. Akhil, glad that you're joining us. We're doing this as part of a build-up for the 2026 Cycles in the City conference in New York between at the very end of May, between the 28th, around about there. We'll get the dates for you at the end. Anyway, but Akhil, there is so much going on in the world right now.
Yeah.
We are seeing a war. Let's get an update on what you think's happening. Tell us where we are in the 18.6-year cycle. Was this part of the plan? Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chinese curses may we live in interesting times, and we certainly do. I don't know if it's necessarily a curse. Certainly, if you're writing about current events, it's actually probably quite good. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Second of all, thank you to the foundation for inviting me again to speak at the conference. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm sure it's going to be even more interesting than last year. And last year was really quite a spectacularly interesting conference. So very much looking forward to that. Now, a quick shout out to the founder of the foundation, Edward Dewey, in his book Cycles and his research. He wrote, I think, quite extensively about the 18 and a half year building and construction cycle. And that is the foundation of what I write about. But I think it's important to acknowledge his discovery of it. And indeed, he was asked to look into cycles in the aftermath of the Great Depression, which was the crisis that followed the boom of the Roaring Twenties, which in itself was an 18-year cycle. Now, I outlined the cycle at the conference last year. It's a 18-year cycle, 14 years up, 4 years crisis, crash, recovery, and so on. And we are very much approaching the peaking of the cycle. And what's interesting is, even if you take aside the effects of the war, which are already becoming apparent, the spike in oil prices, the disruption to supply chains, and the knock-on effect on inflation and uncertainty and volatility in asset markets, I think you were seeing a lot of the signs that you would expect to see at the peak of the 18-year cycle. And indeed, I'm going to go into this in more detail in my talk at the conference in May. But just to say that there is a peaking process at the end of the 18-year cycle. It involves inflation, it involves yields rising, and so on. It involves a lot of political, economic uncertainty. I noticed in the last 12 months, people have been talking about a K-shaped economy, i.e., the top part of society are able to spend because they are essentially taking advantage of, the huge rise in asset prices and great investments and so on that they've made. And, the majority of society are living almost hand to mouth, really struggling to meet payments. This is a function of very high rents, very high land prices, very high rates of interest, inflation, and so on, and it makes things very difficult. So all of the things that we were seeing into January before the conflict started, and January and February, I suppose, were all of what you would expect. The question is, does the war situation throw things off? And I think I will go into this in a bit more detail in my remarks in the conference. But just to give you a little teaser, it's quite interesting that towards the peak of the cycle, the US tends to find itself in some kind of conflict, which does amplify some of the dynamics that you find at the peak of the cycle. And I think we're seeing the same thing now. Now, it might be for very different reasons. I'm not going to go into what the motivations are. I don't think anyone really knows. And governments clearly never tell the full story when they're doing things like this. But it tends to somehow, in some ways quite miraculously, feed into the general dynamics that you would expect to see. So I think we're seeing that again. And so maybe somewhat unexpected, but it's certainly in alignment with my research on the cycles.
So where do you see this heading right now then, Akhil? Actually, let me just explain your book, The Secret Wealth Advantage, which we can see behind you there, is actually, to some extent, an update of Dewey's work, because you've broken down that 18.6-year cycle into very digestible chunks, which highlight each point of it with really pertinent examples. So, it's brought Dewey's work up to date, and I think members of the foundation don't necessarily realize that. That's exactly what you've done. So it's a tremendous read. But where do you see this heading next? Do you see a market crash upon us? And we have talked about this in previous interviews with the foundation and fireside chats where we've looked at this, and there is a topping point in the cycle where we are right now. How bad is it this time? Is it going to play out the same?
That's, I think, in some ways, a $64 million question. So you're right. There is a topping process. It's not, a single event or a single day or a single downturn in a particular metric that is, signals the top. There's a process. There's a slowdown. There's, attempts to recover, to kind of push the economy up, particularly asset markets, housing, house prices, and so on. And I expect that we still will see some of that to come. Which also means that the actual timing of what tends to be a relatively significant bear market at the end of the cycle can sometimes lag. It doesn't always happen right at the peak of the cycle. Famously in 2007, 2008, the real kind of crisis took place after October 2007, but particularly in 2008, whereas the US land market, which drives the 18.6 year cycle, peaked in sometime in end of 2006. So there was a year and a half lag. In the 1920s, the period before which Dewey started doing his research, in fact, the US land cycle peaked around 1926, but of course we had another 2 years of very significant bull market, and that was largely because of the euphoria of the times, the feeling that it was a new era, and also interest rates were lowered in 1926 or 1925, if I'm not mistaken, and a lot of money and liquidity was pumped into the system, largely by the private banking system in the late 1920s, and that caused things, at least in certain parts of the market, to go up for a bit longer. I think it's quite hard to say precisely when the crash is going to take place after the peak. I'm expecting the peaking process is taking place now, and I'll go into why I think that when I speak in New York. And if I were to pin my opinion to the wall right now, I'd say that we're looking probably at some really major kind of crises events within the next 12 months. But, I think it does depend on how things play out over the next a few months in relation to the end of the war, what happens after that. And in fact, as I say that, I think really I should be asking you the question because, I know that this conflict appeared to a lot of people to come out of the blue. But in fact, as we know, it's all cyclical.
Yes.
And I'd be very interested in your perspective on, what cycles are at play, how they're playing out in relation to what's going on at the moment.
Oh, wow. Okay. Right. You've thrown that one at me. Right. Where do we go? We're talking, let's line this up. 18.6 year cycle straight back to the global financial crisis. Okay. So we're happy. We're not happy, but we understand that cycle is playing out. Let me go to the other extreme. Let me make people aware of the 250-year cycle, death and rebirth, an empire cycle. Mm-hmm. So 250 years from 1776, we're in that window right now. And death and rebirth really sees huge transformation in empires. I don't want to necessarily say death of an empire, but it could be a potential, change in the way it operates. It could be a change in leadership of empires. And what we're really seeing, right now, the tremendous American Constitution and Congress and everything don't seem to be involved in anything. And the decision-making process seems to come on somebody's social media profile at random tweets, which impacts markets and global events. Right. So we are seeing this great free nation change to a somewhat more slightly authoritarian leadership in some ways. Not always, a lot of the stuff that's been done has been good for the economy. This war might be different. It may not be. But then we can also tie that in with the 90-year cycle where we saw the build-up of weak nations suddenly being led very decisively. So we've got the 250-year death and rebirth cycle for America, 1776. And of course, you've got to look, there were two parties there. The other side was Great Britain. Well, you and I live here. I've certainly moaned to you about what I think about this government. I know we usually stay apolitical, but I mean, what's left that can't be taxed at the moment? There's nothing, right? So, yeah. So Britain is also at the receiving end of this 250-year cycle. Is it going to deteriorate further? I mean, back in 1776, it was very much rule Britannia. Britannia ruled the waves, the Royal Navy. We have next to no Royal Navy left right now. So Britain and America are both changing. But other superpowers are in play, Russia and China. So we've got to bear in mind that there is a huge reshuffling of the chessboard going on right now. 90 years ago, as I said, we saw this more directive leadership. We are seeing, just after the conference, within a couple of weeks, we've had to bring the conference forward because of the World Cup in America.
Right.
Just no accommodation there. So, but the World Cup will start June, July. That will coincide with the 90-year anniversary of the 1936 Berlin Games, which was highly politicized there. So I'm wondering if we're going to see something similar there. Coming back to the other cycles in play, with regards to Iran, I've written extensively about it, especially in our year ahead report. I've been forewarning people. And in fact, 3 years ago, I wrote about the fact that America would probably be starting a war or be involved in a war in the Middle East within the next few years. And the reason is the longer term cycles here. We can go back to the 45-year cycle that saw the theocracy in Iran come into place. The 90-year cycle saw a swing towards the West, where they the father of the Shah of Iran, the grandfather of the chap now sort of looking for a more open Iran, brought in rules saying, actually, you can't wear the hijab in public. So it was a more liberal move to the West. So the 90-year cycle, the 45-year cycle, the 36-year cycle is also in play, which is double the 18-year cycle. We saw Gulf War I in 1990. America intervened in Iraq. So this is almost, I hate to use the word perfect here, but it is a perfect cycle storm. It's not what we want to see, but it is happening, and it's a reality. And and the shorter term cycles, did show that we were able to identify this down to a day. People were forewarned the day before, and that's worked out well for several people's portfolios. But so, where do you see this unwinding then, Akhil? Where do you see this heading in the short term, politically or mathematically, or in any way you choose to care to discuss, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Like, from a very simplistic point of view, and I don't mean to say that it's, to kind of diminish what I'm about to say, but from a very simplistic point of view, there are always political considerations around the timing and the extent of things like this. And, I think there is a certain amount of unrest in the United States about, firstly, the start of the war, the purpose, the objectives, the length, the cost of it, particularly at a time when, a lot of people, as I've said, are struggling. And this is not easing that. In many ways, it's making it worse. And there are elections on the horizon. I think they are quite significant. Even though it's an incumbent president not running for re-election, and they're only midterms. Nonetheless, I don't think that the president can see Congress united against him, i.e. the Democrats taking over. So I think they are quite important. My understanding of what happens the day after the war conflict ends or ceases is that it will take quite some time for quote unquote normal business to resume. And so, given that the elections are coming up in November, just over 7 months away, I think you probably have to start winding this down relatively soon. And, maybe you could read into that some of, those considerations in what, Trump said last night. So I think that's the kind of simplistic explanation. I know you probably have maybe from a cyclical point of view, a more sophisticated one. The other thing I'd say is, we aren't trying to be political and so on, but I do think motivation for this conflict is quite important, because if it was simply about, negotiating a better deal with Iran or something, putting it in a worse position militarily to negotiate a better deal for the West and for the United States, I think that probably fits into the explanation and the expectation that I've just outlined. If, on the other hand, there's something bigger about this, I think that might dictate the consideration. And I mean, look, it's the reality is that America is relatively selective in where it intervenes around the world. Um, and so, if you look at the last 20 years where it's intervened militarily, it's often in countries which have threatened to sell resources in currencies other than the US dollar. And I think we are seeing quite kind of, I think there's quite wide awareness now that one of the key foundations of US power is the dollar based system and the fact that everyone uses it. And I think there is an element of consideration, strategic consideration, all of this, that a country like Iran that actually could quite happily sell all of its oil in yuan, some of it in euros, was a sort of a somewhat existential threat to the dollar-based system. And I think that is, for certain parts of the State Department and, War Department and the administration, I think this is a very significant consideration. Now, if that is the case, then maybe some of the calculus that I've described doesn't apply. Anyway, look, it's very easy for us to get caught up in lots of different explanations. I don't think everyone would agree with what I've just said, and I don't really want to get into a discussion about it. It's not really the point of what I'm trying to say. We're trying to, allow our sort of readers and people who invest on the basis of what we say to make more informed decisions. I just think that a lot of the surface explanations that I've seen are not really adequate, and that kind of makes me feel a little uneasy about making very concrete forecasts. And maybe, it's a perfect example of where we have to rely on cycles to help us unpack all of these things. So maybe based on what you've said in terms of the longer and shorter term cycles, maybe you've got some further insight which you share now or at the conference.
Well, let's do a little teaser now. I haven't really decided yet what to talk about at the conference. It's so far away, yet it's round the corner, and we're in a very fast-moving world.
Exactly, might all be over by then.
Yeah,
talk about then.
Yeah. Well, from a cycles perspective, oil, for example, I don't mind sharing this, but I do have some huge cycles for oil this month that does suggest that the oil side will be resolved to some extent,
right?
But it's not going to be a complete resolution. But really, I actually concur with you on this notion of the dollar supremacy, as it were, because I think that's where the greatest challenge comes. It has been a printing press since the Bretton Woods Agreement disbanded. And my view is that this war really is about making sure the BRICS nations do not gain any further advantage. Iran has, been has been flirting with the BRICS nations as well. So, and more than that. And I think realistically that if there were to be a central currency from these nations, which was backed by, say, gold and silver, which some of these countries, India holds quite a bit of that, as does China, there could be a threat to the US dollar. But the cycles angle on this really is that we would have to start looking just a few years ahead till we come to the 60-year anniversary from the breakup of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which would also coincide with America bringing the US dollar off the gold standard in the 100-year cycle. So there's a cycle correlation there. That's a little bit of a teaser. Maybe I'll do a bit more work and look at that. But that's my view, is that this is a fight for one of the reasons. One of the reasons here is this is a fight for the retention of the dollar as the global reserve currency. So, you've given us some teasers about what you're going to talk about, Akhil. Do you want to tell us a bit more? I mean, there's some. But let me just for the people watching this. Larry Williams will be with us again this year, along with John Bollinger. And I know many of you are thinking, John Bollinger, what's he to do with cycles? He's going to present his take on cycles. So, right. A very highly respected technical analyst. I've not seen his cycles work, but obviously we all know about Bollinger Bands. Right. We've got Michael Howell coming in. I believe Peter Borush. Yeah, Peter Borush is going to come and talk, I believe. Now, Peter Borush, you might not know that name as well as his business partners, but a very significant investor, fund manager, and somebody who, the roots of their billions came from the library of data at the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. So he popped in just to say hello. He came off a flight, and that was a real treat, an exciting treat for us. There he was working with Paul Tudor Jones. So, and he was the cycles part of it that really put them up there. So we've got these exciting names coming in. Last year, I mean, one of the nice things about being together, in New York was it was the chats in between the cocktail parties and then grabbing dinner, going down to the pub, and people coming in from all over the world. Was there anything in particular that stood out for you? I mean, your presentation was excellent. And there was some incredible new discoveries and research items put forward. But what really stood out for you last time?
I mean, in addition to the breadth and variety of talks, I mean, it's the fact that I work on cycles, but I've never been to a conference where everyone else in the room, all the other speakers and people who are participating are also really interested in cycles. So basically, any conversation you have, there's always some further insights that you can glean. So definitely the networking, but the talks themselves were particularly good. I know that there's been a lot of public consideration and discussion about the fourth turning, and I remember the person who used the fourth turning framework, but then to talk about the sort of impact on human physiology. I thought that was particularly fascinating. So yeah, I mean, I'm really impressed by the breadth and variety of people that the foundation is able to convene. It's really quite impressive. And in fact, I listen quite avidly to people like Michael Howell, so I'm very much looking forward to meeting him and picking his brains.
So yeah, it was a tremendous gathering of people, and of course, it was also good to go down the Irish Bar and various other places, all very central, all in Midtown. So it was a great atmosphere. Mm. And honestly, let's just be honest about it. Most of you are cycle geeks watching this. We're just open about it. That's it. So it gives us a good opportunity to exchange ideas. So it's at the SUNY down on East 55th in New York. And I think it's going to be a tremendous occasion. So I'm looking forward to seeing you. In fact, it might be the next time I actually see you, Akhil. Might be in New York rather in London or over here. So I think, please make sure you come along. We have got a limited number of seats. I know we've sold quite a few already, thanks to Bill Rooney and the team. So, it's all a non-profit. So all this is going back to research further and taking things to the next level. So, Akhil, thank you so much for joining us. I hope people have got a little bit more of an understanding of some of the cycles and your perspective of the 18.6-year war, a cycle on the war, and we've been able to throw some longer term cycles in there. So, Akhil, we'll see you out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Likewise. Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much.
Cycles matter because they show us the future. Nothing else shows us a future path. Nothing that I've ever found in over 60 years of doing this.
Foundation is bigger than markets, right? It started out bigger than markets. It's still bigger than markets. It's bigger than us.
There is no such thing as a black swan. It is merely a cycle that was not forecast or anticipated.
To me, it's huge. If I can get a glimpse of the future, just a little bit of the future, I'm way ahead.
I think that the Foundation for the Study of Cycles has a role to play in both bringing technology to the world, but also really emphasizing agency and human agency.